book.
You need to hold the book up again because now it's going to be in the recording. Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown, which is perhaps one of the reasons why we've been so fortunate to welcome Laurie Laybourn-Langton today, who is our GSI seminar speaker. Where do I begin? Okay, so he's got such an impressive biography. Let me just take you out a couple of highlights that's going to help contextualize today's talk. So one of the reasons he's here, yes, okay, Laurie's flogging a book. No, but the real reason he's here today is that he is a visiting fellow at the Global Systems Institute, University of Exeter. So that's great. We are very, very excited that Laurie wants to be a part of our GSI journey. And there's lots of exciting things that we hope to do with Laurie. So above and beyond all the cool things and maybe frightening things Laurie might want to talk about today, there are going to be the opportunities to work with Laurie on academic projects, on projects which might have a bit more of a policy focus or maybe even beyond. So if anything sounds interesting about today, then be sure to keep in touch because I know Laurie's going to want to talk to you and see what we can spin up, right? He's also an associate fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research, the IPPPR, and you might have known some of that work from the Responding to Environmental Breakdown program, which in 2019 was the Prospect Think Tank of the Year award, right? So that was an important piece of work, and I think that's how I first came to know of Laurie, actually. He is also a trustee of the New Economics Foundation. So if you don't know the work of the New Economics Foundation, then you should immediately go out after this seminar and track them down because they do some really, really cool, important work. Certainly a source for hope and optimism, I think, the new kind of thinking that we've got around rebuilding, reconfiguring our economic systems. And yes, he is the co-author with Matthew Lawrence of Planet on Fire, a Manifesto for the Age of Environmental Breakdown. That was published in April. And I'm sure is doing very, very well. And if you haven't got a copy, you must buy one. It is a very, very good book. Previous to Laurie's involvement with us, he was at the Grantham Institute, LSE. He's been at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, Oxford. He is an Exeter lad in that he did his bachelor's in physics here a number of years ago. And that was followed by an MPhil in economics at Oxford. Without further ado, because we could spend the rest of the afternoon, how wonderful Laurie is. Without further ado, I will hand over to Laurie, whose title of the talk is I've forgotten.
I actually changed it I've changed it again.
I was going to give the big preamble about the urgent need for radical and new thinking about where we are heading and the kind of possible future we're going to have. But I know you're going to do that much better than me. So over to you, Laurie.
Thanks, James. And also David for doing the promo for the book that I'm still neglecting to do at the moment. It's lovely to see so many of you here, friendly faces, and particular hello to colleagues from GSI that I've not met yet, and I hope to meet soon. And I also hope to be down for the social at the beginning of July. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of more of a personal journey that I've gone on through working in public policy land to try and introduce some themes that I'd like to get to and what I hope will be a discussion after I've gone through my slides. I'm going to try and get them up now, so bear with me as I do this. I'm assuming you can all see this.
That looks good.
Great. So I'm calling this Into the Storm, and I'll introduce in a minute the frame that sits behind that. In summary, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about overall strategy and where we stand with it when it comes to restabilizing and restoring the natural world, and then dealing with the adverse consequences that we're faced with. And I take there Catherine Hayhoe's frame of mitigation, adaptation, and suffering, and having to mediate across those. And we're, through this presentation, going to look at the current overarching strategies related to mitigation, adaptation, and then how we can mediate or deal with that suffering. And the question here is whether we've got the overall strategy right across those three parts. And my argument is going to be that current policy strategies, and I mean that in a broad, big picture sense, do not constitute the required emergency response, and also aren't necessarily live to the types of destabilizing impacts that will grow as we head forward into the coming years. And the project to the former of that emergency response could be increasingly threatened by the consequences of the latter. And so more explicit work is needed and can be done to ensure that policies, but also politics in general, advocacy strategies and leadership are robust to this emergent age of consequences, I guess we could describe it as. And I'm going to be looking here very much at stories, a personal one, as I was saying, and these slides are going to be full with sort of provocative images and not necessarily bullet points, because I know we're all oversaturated by being on Zoom calls and staring at quite detailed slides with lots of bullet points on. So hopefully this can be a bit more of a high level tour, a bit of a provocation for us to then get into a discussion. And just to finish off before I launch in, my perspective here is mainly UK and USA. That's the policy environment that I've been in through think tanks and a little bit of academia, as James was saying in the introduction. And I've tried to mix in some of the recent discussion around net zero as a frame that James and others have played important parts in, even in recent weeks. And my point there is not to necessarily attack net zero as a frame itself, but to inspect our strategies for trying to get towards that. And sure, we can be accused that doing that can provide ammunition for delays, but I still think it's important to inspect those. And I will be doing partly from an intergenerational perspective. And I'm at the beginning of my 30s, which is an important bit of the context I'll get onto later. So to begin, over the last number of decades, I think you could argue that the mainstream narrative on the environmental emergency has been akin to warning fellow crewmates on a ship of a far off storm. And that's definitely what I've experienced in policy and in the political communities I've moved through. A small deviation in course would avoid disaster in the future. And that's often the kind of frame that a lot of policymaking was employing when it came to environmental crisis. In the intervening period, that bearing was not changed, and in many ways the ship accelerated. And human activity is now, of course, critically destabilizing natural systems from local to global levels. And so I think we could say that we're well into the storm and heading deeper. Now, working in the public policy research world and a bit of politics and campaigning, I know this was the case for many people, was immensely frustrated that the environmental emergency, the depth, the scale, the pace, wasn't recognized in much of the policy discussions that at least I was privy to, and the frame that many politicians were using, and let alone was it treated like the emergency. And we often saw in communities that were very much engaged with this, particularly people around green campaigning organizations, that certain language was attenuated as well. We often had this frame of don't talk about how bad it is too much, or else you'll put people off. And since mid-2018, I and others have been hugely energized by the huge explosion of campaigning and advocacy and politics that we've seen around the world. And it's been marvelous, I think, to witness that. And the project that James talked about in the introduction, the Responding to Environmental Breakdown project that I ran at IPPR, we started in mid-2018, sort of propelled by our frustration that people weren't talking about the scale of this emergency, and were buoyed by the changes that we saw from mid-2018, some of which you can see in these pictures here. And it really did make a difference in our ability to talk in policymaking and political circles, this energy that we saw and the types of action that people were talking about. Now, much of that action have been driven by employing narratives of imminent and profound threat and the necessity of emergency action, which I would strongly agree with. Now, often they would employ binary or absolute frames, or the frames that were then adopted by others, particularly the media, often interpreted that way. So we had the 12 years to save the world narrative. We were talking about having to halve emissions by 2030 to give us a shot at the 1.5 degree target, after which we could face inevitable near-term social collapse, but don't worry, a global Green New Deal can save the planet. And I'm not here necessarily to debate the strategic merits of that language at the time it was used, but to inspect the types of strategies or frames that we have in our minds when we're talking about policymaking going forward. After being desperate for a shift in that language, these new frames, many of them displayed on the screen there, had me thinking. Alongside a range of problems that we face, some of those frames can obscure the key features of being in this storm instead of warning about us being propelled towards it. And I'm going to talk about two particular elements here. Firstly, the complexities that we need to navigate to have a credible strategy for restabilizing and restoring the natural world. So looking more at mitigation, and then how they can underplay or ignore the challenges that we will face as the consequences grow, as temperatures increase. And I'll start first with mitigation. So as always, our question for policymakers should be, do we have a credible strategy for repairing and restabilizing from local levels all the way up to global levels? Now, we obviously saw the Australian Academy a little while ago saying that limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees is now virtually impossible. So another one of these frames that's then picked up by particularly the media. And in many ways, the attention we saw on that statement misses the overall point, which should be this question about a credible strategy. And here it's important for us to remember that this is not just about the climate system. We want to be looking at the impacts upon other natural systems, and then also the risks, of course, of non-linear behaviors. So we've got a raft of issues, I think, that we face with when it comes to strategies around concepts like net zero. Some of these here are rehearsed from some of the recent commentary on net zero that, as I was mentioning, James has been involved with, as well as others. We're seeing some encouraging signs, as we're reminded often, and it's good to be reminded of that countries are signing up to targets, including in the near term, that businesses are doing similarly, and other actors in society, that the price of technology is falling and technological development is continuing apace, that the value of certain destructive industries is being destroyed, that consumer tastes are changing. But referencing back to that question before, have we got a credible strategy to be doing this, to be working towards those targets quick enough? And I think we've got two big issues that we face there. The first is that we're banking on vast negative emissions technologies. And this graph here that many of you may have seen from Glenn Peters gives you an idea of the huge challenge that's being placed on the shoulders of anyone below a certain age. I mean, you look at that, and essentially the policy strategies of the past employed by previous generations have decided your fate for you. You're going to have to be part of a vast intergenerational effort to become extraordinarily competent carbon suckers. And that's quite an intimidating thing to imagine. And it raises the questions, well, is this the best that we can manage, that we have to have this necessity for negative emissions? If it is, where is the huge globally coordinated industrial policy and nature restoration effort to create the negative emissions technologies that would be able to get us to this point? If we are allowing overshoot within this frame, can we accept the mortality and morbidity that will inevitably come from that? We're already seeing this, particularly in countries in the global south. How much more we will see as we head to and beyond 1.5? Can we cope with the balance of risk when it comes to feedbacks? Can we handle the socioeconomic and political destabilization that will come from this? And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we've got this massive question about negative emissions technologies. Now, even without that, even let's say we didn't find ourselves in a situation where that's being argued for, we have to ask whether our strategy for rapidly reducing environmental impacts, the policies that will enable that, are the right ones or provide enough. This GIF here is the summary, basically, of this International Energy Agency report that James and Dave were talking about as people were joining, and shows here what a net zero timeline would look like, including with some of that, the negative emissions, the drawing down that you can see underneath the axis there. And it's a fantastic but long-awaited effort in which to look at what that credible pathway would look like. As we look at that, we have to ask ourselves the question, are the enabling policies to get there? So I don't just mean the policies that we use to deploy certain technologies or to put targets into place. I mean the policies that then enable the rollout of those technologies, the ones behind them, and I'll explain that a bit more in a minute. Are they enough? And I think that the status quo effort at the moment, you could largely characterize as swapping dirty technologies and some behaviors for clean alternatives. So diesel and petrol vehicles for electric, for example, and to ensure that the market mechanisms are there by which that is done far quicker than is currently the case. But I think that comes up against three major problems. The first is consumption. So do we have enough of the overall environmental budget, not just carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, but also soils to deplete, species to push into extinction and ecosystems to destroy, to swap all of the current dirty stuff for clean alternatives, and to keep up the growth in essentially a high impact Western lifestyle. And we heard the other day, John Kerry in the US saying that we don't have to give up quality of life to achieve some of the things we know we have to achieve. And that the key question there is, what does he mean by quality of life? Does he mean a particular type of quality of life, or does he mean quality of life in general? And if it's the latter, then I would agree with him, and we'll go into that a bit more in a minute. So the first issue for the status quo approach that we're starting to see emerge, that is very positive to see, is consumption. The second, I would say, is power. So if we look at, one second, we have to ask ourselves a question. Can we, for example, go down that IEA curve and that net zero pathway that I just showed in the GIF before, if we have the current attitude that we have towards debt and deficits? Can we do it if we have certain international treaties like the Energy Charter Treaty, which can allow private corporations to sue countries in investor-state dispute mechanisms, which are done behind closed doors? Can we move down that IEA curve if we have the huge amount of indebtedness that we see in the global south at the moment that is restraining their capability to deliver mitigation and adaptation? And these are huge questions which fundamentally themselves question the status quo approach to, in particular, economic policy. And so we have to ask ourselves whether the current power balance allowed by the status quo is itself enough. And of course, the second element that comes with that is fairness. And that's not just a practical question, a moral question, it's also a pressing practical question. Can we achieve the levels of cooperation that we need to move our way down that IEA curve in a high inequality world? And I think there's a huge question over that, and one that's been really highlighted by the pandemic itself and the response to the pandemic. And that pushes us into a situation where we have to conclude or agree with the words from a recent United Nations Environment Programme synthesis report, which themselves were taken from previous IPBES releases, that say only a fundamental system-wide transformation across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values, can reverse the current trends that threaten the well-being of present and future generations and the survival of other species. We can't do this with a status quo approach to economics and to economic policy. It demands deeper structural changes to our economies. And I do not think that that is something that is in the mainstream policy and political consciousness at the moment. Now, thankfully, things are changing. We're seeing a myriad of ideas, some of which are increasingly being adopted by the mainstream, that could potentially bring us there. And there are a flurry there on the screen, including Stephanie Kelton's work questioning the logic of this deficit myth that we must constrain government spending, which is often an artificial constraint, of donut economics, of community wealth building, the idea of ensuring that local communities can ground the creation of wealth and other value in their local communities, as well as big picture mission-oriented approaches to economic policy that are championed by Mariana Mazzucato and are being adopted by governments around the world. And these don't just talk about how we can increase the size of the state or increase government spending, though some of them do. They look at how we can have a more localized approach, say, to our economic paradigm, one in which we look at concepts of public luxury and communal sharing over concepts of sort of mass material consumption that at the moment are in large parts the lodestar of our political and economic imaginary. But it's going to be a huge political fight to be able to get there and to deliver many of these things, which brings me on to my next point. I spend a lot of time working with many of these groups through a lot of the stuff that I've done. And throughout the whole time I would talk to them, it became clear to me that in crude terms, some of them didn't have an understanding of how the medium term will play out. And by that, I mean, how will you continue to fight for and then hopefully implement the policy ideas, some of which we see on the screen here, in a world that is going to be far warmer and as a result, far more destabilized. And this is where we have to get into questions of how are we going to continue to fight for these types of changes in a world that's going to become more destabilized. And I'll talk you through exactly what I mean by that and what I think the implications are. And then I will finish off by introducing a project that I'm working on, which will be the main locus for some of the work I hope to engage with many of you in. So I'm going to pick on Bill Mckibben here now to illustrate the point that I want to make here. And this is probably an unfair picking on of Bill Mckibben, who I have huge respect for, and I think is just an absolutely brilliant ally when it comes to any of this, or indeed much of our work is founded on his fantastic campaigning. But in a review last summer of Mark Linus's new book about 6 degrees and the various impacts that we will see as we go up the scales of degrees, at the end he writes this: in a coda, he, Mark Linus, writes valiantly, it's not too late. And in fact, it will never be too late. Just as 1.5 is better than 2, and 2 is better than 2.5, 3 is better than 3.5, and so on, we should never give up. This is unarguable, at least emotionally. It's just that, as the studies he cites makes clear, if we go to 2 degrees, that will cause feedbacks that take us automatically higher. At a certain point, it will be too late. The first of these deadlines might be 2030. Now, I may be unfairly picking on him here, and he may contest what I'm about to say, but when I read that at the time, I found it immensely frustrating, not just because maybe it's slightly skewed interpretation of how those feedbacks could work or any precision around them, but more this phrase, too late. Now, let's introduce the intergenerational frame here. The median age of a political leader in Europe is around 50, 52. The average age of an MP here in the UK is about 50. Now, if you're my age, or say the age of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the sort of leading millennial politicians of my generation, you will reach that age, 52, in around 2040. And we know that we could be well above 1.5 at that point, or at some point, or somewhere around 2 degrees, depending on, of course, a whole range of things that we don't necessarily know how they will play out. So from our perspective, and I mean from that generation's perspective, that too late is what we're going to have to live through. It's a future that we must be ready for and be able to respond to, one in which we have to take forward the struggles of not just winning certain systemic change, but then implementing it in what will end up being a vast multi-generational project to restabilize and to restore the natural world. And so it's very important that we begin to develop a more detailed, less binary frame on what that future could look like. Now, that has always been a part of, say, adaptation studies and the huge amount of work and financing and project delivery that's going on adaptation. And we have been provided with even better understandings of what that future could look like, or what the trends could be like from quantitative studies that say we're going to have X more heat stress, or Y more people will be exposed to flooding, or there'll be Z reduction in crop yields. We've had 2 prominent studies recently that projected 10% to 23% loss of global GDP this century if emissions are not rapidly cut, and about 4% if they're cut faster. That's useful, but it obscures the complexities. We've got to do better. We've got to better understand the complexities of what that future looks like. And to quote Emma Howard Boyd, the chair of the Environment Agency here in England from last October at a conference, no government or government agency can possibly know what the status quo looks like in either a 1.5 degree world or even a 3.9 degree world. And this is because environmental threats go beyond just the localized impacts of climate breakdown, which is often the thing that captures the policy imaginary, at least in terms of the adaptation discussion. And we can no longer compartmentalize risk, can't represent it as being simple and overly quantifiable. we've got to look beyond just short-term direct consequences. And particularly in global north countries, we need to make sure that we no longer think of the distant as merely marginal, where discontinuities, if they do happen, don't come back to hit us. And COVID should be our last warning there. As the UN Office on Disaster Risk Reduction has said, the era of hazard by hazard risk reduction is over. And we've got to understand now that the types of destabilization that we're already seeing and will increasingly see come from a range of factors beyond just those associated or primarily driven by the climate crisis. They ripple out through interconnected social, economic, political systems to have impacts beyond just the area in which they initially hit. And then they interact with the existing social and economic context. And of course, many countries around the world, even before COVID, were already experiencing quite a stressed socioeconomic context. And those systems in which these impacts can ripple out through are themselves vulnerable to growing destabilization. Efficiency has often been put as a priority over the resilience of those systems. And we see that, for example, through the supply chains for the coronavirus vaccines, where I think the Pfizer vaccine, for example, has 280 components and relies upon 25 suppliers located in 19 different countries. Now, that is a marvel of the modern economy and an increasingly globalized society in some respects. But we have to ask ourselves the question, are we resilient across those systems and others like political systems for this kind of world? So we need to be aware of more systemic destabilization across a number of factors. Now, people are increasingly realizing this, right? And this is where you get sometimes the idea that we're heading towards a cliff edge, that we're going to get near-term societal collapse, that we are very rapidly going to move up the exponential curve of environmental destabilization, and that will cause our systems to snap and to collapse. And often those sort of use frames that are akin to a Hollywood film, where the sort of society collapses and everyone's sort of wandering around in the wreckage after it. But I think that that is not the case, that when we look at varying degrees of the types of destabilization that we're already seeing around the world, it's a far more complex picture. And this picture is taken from the Global Assessment Report, which was released every 2 years by the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Office as part of its mandate in what's called the Sendai framework, which looks at disaster risk reduction. And it shows you the type of sort of flooding downhill, how risks grow and compound and accelerate each other. It's not a cliff edge that we're heading towards. It's more like we're heading off the smooth road of the last many, many thousands of years onto a much more bumpy topography. Now, that may lead inexorably downwards to a cliff edge at the end, but we need to learn to understand better and preempt the dodgy pitfalls that we will experience along the way. And the current adaptation agenda, I would say, isn't sufficient to do that. The other day, Alok Sharma said, sort of expressing the classical, the mainstream frame on adaptation, we need to work together to enable and encourage countries affected by climate change to build flood defenses and climate resilient infrastructure, to introduce early warning systems and plant crops resistant to climate extremes. Well, I think we need to go beyond that a bit and make sure that we're looking at a range of things. Our policy responses need to be better prepared for a range of areas, not just being adapted to infrastructure shocks, but also understanding how, for example, political systems could be stressed by some of the cascading risks that you see on this diagram here. And that means that we need to have a much wider frame on soft adaptation. One of the big fears that often arrests people, and I think they are legitimate, is that you will increasingly get an eco-nativist approach in politics, where someone my age, maybe in 20 years' time, will lead a political party and say that liberal elites knew that this was a major problem. They didn't do enough, and now we're having to deal with the consequences. And the best way to do that is to put up borders and to repel others who are coming for what we have, for what's left. But we also need to make sure it's not just our politics and our policy that are better prepared for this world. It's also our advocacy strategies. So we need to make sure that the strategies to try and realize some of the policies that I talked about earlier, your donor economics, on and on, are themselves robust to the threats and opportunities of a 1.7 degree world, a 1.8 degree world, and so on. And then within that leadership, and I mean that across all scales of society and in all sectors, is itself able to cope with all of the kind of threats and opportunities that will exist in that world. What's the role, for example, of academics in the context of a 1.5 plus degree world? Are they well placed to explain to societies who have suddenly realized or are unable to ignore the scale of the challenge and the destabilization what is going on so other actors don't? What's their relationship with policymakers who will be scrambling around to try and develop a systems thinking frame to understand feedback loops that may be clearly occurring across the world? And the questions go on. And to finish off, in this IPPR work that we did, we define this as a new domain of risk. We've had domains of risk in the past, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the wider period of nuclear tensions between the Soviet Union and America, where growing, ratcheting tensions could have led to the ultimate position of a nuclear exchange. And there was a very different risk calculus across the world in that kind of setting. There's been a domain of risk since the deregulation of the financial sector since the 80s, and also with the collapse of various mediating monetary institutions across the world that have led to a higher likelihood of financial crisis. And there's a particular risk calculus that exists there. We're talking about one on a much higher scale. And it's that is going to have to be developed and internalized by decision makers, because in many ways, we're new arrivals on the kind of planet that is emerging, and no one has governed under conditions of 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 degrees. And in the space of a generation, people are going to have to do that. And of course, work with others who may have been there for longer. And so to finish off, I'm about to embark on a research project that is going to try and develop a bit more of an accessible synthesis of the nature of this accelerating destabilization, one that complements existing analyses with very quantified metrics of X heat stress by various particular points, and tries to think more of the type of domain of risk that we will be dealing with. It will then be exploring the implications for policy, but also for politics and other more softer areas that aren't often looked at. And then thirdly, to convene an intergenerational dialogue to better explore what kind of policy and practice and leadership my generation, those blurs, will need as we take on the next chapter in this struggle, as we head further into the storm and we increasingly have to chart a way out, but also deal with the impacts of the storm hitting us that could militate against that agenda. So I will leave it there. I know I covered a lot, but I hope that's a provocative stimulant for then a discussion that we will have. And thanks very much for listening.
Many thanks. Thank you, Laurie. So as always, we invite questions. We invite questions on the chat. If you want to raise your hand, actually by putting your camera on, wow, Amanda's straight in there, or by raising your hand virtually. But I think we might have the first question from Amanda.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. Thanks, Laurie. Fab and thought-provoking as always. Just a quickie, because I've got to scoot off in a minute. I spent this morning at my Extinction Rebellion trial, and it's an enlightening experience in terms of the understanding of our august institutions as to exactly what sort of situation we're in, utterly lost in their own detail and their own processes, and incapable almost of looking at anything approaching the bigger picture. So my question to you really is, they were asked, do you understand the context of the climate crisis? And there's, oh yes. And I thought, oh no, you have no idea. So the question here really for me is, that occupies a lot of my mind a lot of the time. How do we collectively enable a much greater level of transgression of thought, of the academy, our imagination, of our greater and lesser institutions, whether they be anchor institutions or other institutions, to enable us to even begin to create the space where we can start thinking about this at the scale that you're talking about? Because so much of this is about the contrary hot mess of the human psyche, and that is one of our major flaws here that is stopping us engaging with what you're talking about at the level and scale and quantity and speed. How do we enable that? Donut economics is a case in point, but a lot of what you talk about generally is similarly transgressive. We need more disruption of thought. How do we enable that?
Great question, of course, and also thanks for doing what you've been doing there and having to go through that trial. And I would really point to that because it's an example of what I see as an increasingly mature, what I think you could call ecosystem of influence that's really starting to grow up around the context of the environmental emergency. Often I find that people who are operating in, say, a campaign group over here, a think tank over here, a media organization over there, a politician over here, sometimes don't see of themselves as existing in an ecosystem of influence that may not have direct connections to certain groups, as in they don't talk to each other, but all the same, they are moving in some kind of way that leads to an overall result. And I think that over the last number of decades, we haven't necessarily seen a level of sort of critical threshold of maturity across that ecosystem has not yet been achieved. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we've got far more depth and breadth, I think, to that ecosystem. So much more of a developed social movement, for example, that I think you could fairly have argued that prior to the latest explosion of activity with Extinction Rebellion, with Fridays for Future and otherwise, did exist, but maybe wasn't of the level of complexity and size that was actually getting cut through. And on one side, it's really, I find the discussions over, say, the future of Extinction Rebellion and its previous inadequacies, particularly when it comes to representation of certain groups, as sometimes for some people quite depressing to have to go through, but at the other side, a really positive sign that there's an innovative energy within that ecosystem because people are clamoring to create the next thing as we move up that hopefully exponential curve of that ecosystem developing. And pointing there, I am to Tim's stuff on and others on that exponential increase in change. For me, one of the big issues here, at least in the UK, is that there isn't necessarily, and you're going to have to forgive me for maybe thinking a bit simplistically here, but this is the world I come from, there isn't necessarily the maturity focus more on the parliamentary system that we maybe need at this point and could be really useful. In the US, we've got quite a mature transmission mechanism from the social movements they have there, like, for example, the Sunrise Movement, supported by quite mature policy actors like think tanks, new and old, but also other research organizations and local people who are experimenting with models of a new economy on the local level. And they are feeding through toward parliamentary advocates or in Congress, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. And that's not just useful in that you've got a much more direct mechanism there into legislation, but also because of the way our political systems are geared at the moment, it provides much more of a bigger, just more attention because the media and other actors are still geared towards what politicians say. And in the UK, I don't think we have that yet. I think we've got a bit more the think tank element, the research element, and maybe I would say that because of where I work. But the connection all the way through to, say, a caucus of, I'm going to say it, millennial MPs who are fantastic advocates for this and can say, I'm not just talking about my local constituency, I'm also talking about the people who have been on the street over the last few years. That's a key bit of the equation that I think is missing at the moment to further develop the maturity of that ecosystem of influence. And I think that's you could see that as the next bit of momentum, quanta of momentum that just takes us further up that exponential curve. And I am sure that there are others who are thinking about other bits. And one particular bit that I've always admired are those who are in local authorities who are applying a local systems view, anchor institutions otherwise, that are looking at how you can have an approach that at the local level is much more geared towards developing social and economic outcomes that adhere to social determinants of health as well as environmental determinants as well.
Thank you.
There's lots more to said in that, and I'd love to find out more about how the academy can become more transgressive in that field, but that's a really interesting answer.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Thank you.
Okay, Nathan has got his hand up for a next question. I'm just going to jump in and maybe a question for Amanda and Laurie, actually. To what extent is the UK lagging behind a consequence of its more centralised form of governance? And certainly over the last 10 years, there's been a bit of a hollowing out of local authority, local government. We still have a very kind of monolithic, centralised way of doing government in in the country. Is that related in any way, do you think, or is it just there's no reason why we couldn't see the kind of increase in speed of reaction that Laurie's just outlined in the UK with its current government systems?
Andy,
I would say we're lacking a level of arsiness at community level that you might see in some of the very more federalised, the way in which the cantons operate, for example, across parts of Europe. We haven't quite got that. I would say the average age of local councillors, is about 140. That's a slight exaggeration, but we could do with bringing it down. And the difficulty is that moving the new generation that Laurie was talking about into that, they're just horrified at what they have, at the waters they have to swim in, and the chalices they have to drink from, the horse trading that has to go on, the quality of the debate. So we have got a bit of a problem there. We do need to stir that up a lot and quite quickly. I'm sure Laurie's got a view.
Yeah, and I just add two things to this. One is that, well, three things. One, yes, we're in a situation now where we have basically parliamentary dictatorships that can have sway over central policy across the country, and that's a huge barrier, but could also flip in the other direction quite quickly, potentially. The second is that another key element of centralization, kind of alluding to what Amanda was going into, is centralization within political parties. It's incredibly dispiriting to look at how the process you'd have to go through to be or even try and become a candidate, to be then in election, to be elected as an MP in any of the political parties, pretty much, or the ones that have the ability to get many hundreds of people elected to Parliament. And that's a huge barrier, and one that is, you could contrast to, say, the journey that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went on, to use her again, in the US, where there was an open primary selection, and she was able to beat the incumbent Democratic candidate in that area who'd been there for a long time and sort of epitomized the failures of the status quo within her own party, and do that in a very public way, which itself created a block of power that she was able to use, not just to win the election, but to make change when she had then won that election. So the centralization of parties is very difficult. And then the third is that I think there's a lot to be hugely buoyed up about when it comes to experimentation that's happening at local government level, even within the constraints that they face. People may have heard of the Preston model, which is often bandied around, of local community wealth building, where decisions and power and wealth are sort of maintained more in the local area and used to try and further certain social, economic and environmental outcomes. And for me, the Preston model, or variations of it, say in Greater Manchester, where there's a lot of interesting work around, say, the social determinants of health, that the environmental crisis is the cause that has really been waiting for, to give it rocket boosters, to make it a viable model, a kind of new municipalism that roots power to change and also the resources to do so across the UK.
That's great, thanks. We have another question.
We have Nathan as well.
Yeah, Nathan, please.
Thanks, dudes. Hey, Laurie, how's it going?
Very well, good to see you.
And you? So my question.
Nathan, sorry, before you ask, Nathan was my lab tutor in my third year at the end of physics, and put up with all sorts of terrible stuff for me. So
I like to see myself as long-term occasional mentor. Maybe that's overstating it.
Unky Nath is what we called you. Even at the time was what we called him. Anyway, go.
Yeah, great to see you. Great talk. Thank you. I know you spoke about this in the talk, but I wanted to push you a little bit more on the challenges and opportunities that our experience of the pandemic have sort of shown us with regard to the climate emergency. Something that's really surprised me is how quickly we've become more local in our mindset in the face of that kind of threat. But there are silver linings in the sense that you talked about, this other connectiveness, which you gave the example of the Pfizer vaccine. But I'd be really interested in your thoughts of what do we need to look out for, or how we might use what's just happened and is still happening to sort of carry that some of the lessons forward to help us with the climate emergency.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I'm going to answer it in two ways. The first is to probably recycle back some of the things that everyone has in their minds anyway. The opportunity, for example, which is probably going to be missed, to build on things like mutual aid groups and institutionalize them. into a much more localized capacity for, I mean, that could be the basis for plugging into the communal ownership of renewable energy, for example, and for reforming the health and social care system. And there's a load of that capacity that appeared out of nowhere, that was bubbling to get through anyway, that the pandemic stimulated, which I think sadly is going to be dissipated quite quickly, that could have been institutionalized. But we shouldn't feel too depressed about that, I think, because it's always there wanting to bubble over in local communities, that community care, knee-jerk reaction to kind of moments of where things become very tough and we all feel like there's more of a collective we than maybe we did in normal times. It provides a huge opportunity for policymakers to have ditched some of the sacred cows that have dominated in constrained policymaking for a number of decades, things like that deficit myth, to open up the ability to use degrees of the monetary financing of public money so that we can actually make the investments that we need. You know, to anyone who understood properly how fiscal monetary policy works, it came as no surprise that when we really needed it, we can just spray money around. And we knew that from wars and other things in the past. But the COVID pandemic has really finally, hopefully, been the thing that gives people ends the excuse to be talking about deficit, but I'm sure that won't be the case either. It also gives, and this goes to this is the second point, which is the one where I want to be trying to contribute some more novel stuff with the research that I'm going to do. Basically, it reminds people in countries like the UK, in relatively insulated communities like policymaking politics, that really bad stuff can happen. It can happen very quickly. It can arrest your systems and overcome a constrained capacity to respond. And that's sort of that's what happened. And that a health crisis, like a crisis of viral transmission, became a health crisis, became a social crisis, became a political crisis, became an economic crisis, and on and on and on and on. And at the moment, not only do we not have a sufficient understanding of the nature of 21st century crises like this, systemic destabilization, the stuff that we're heading into more in mainstream policy and politics, we also don't have it among those communities who are trying to push for greater action on the environmental emergency. Now, I think everyone is thinking about it. That's the future that they know in some ways we're heading into, and of course, of trying to fight us from heading further into. But we need to mature our understanding of it to start to actually bring it to bear on our strategies for the next few decades. So, for example, if you're a Green New Deal campaigner, what's your strategy for talking about migration? Because maybe in the future, when the hundreds of millions of people who've been forcibly displaced that are being warned about by the World Bank and the UN are going to be fueling far-right political narratives. Like, what's your strategy for that? And how can we start talking about that in a different way now, so we don't set ourselves up for a trap later when that becomes more of a dominant political frame? And you know, the list goes on and on like that. And the work that I'm going to do, and this really is the thing where I hope we can provide some novel insights, is to try and develop a more accessible, non-binary cliff edge, the world's going to end frame to the medium term, and then work out more our political strategies and ways of advocating that can be robust for a world that's not going to be like the 2010s, and a world that many of us haven't seen before, none of us have seen before.
Just to say, Laurie, that's an excellent answer, and it's really picked up something. I think that's a key strand, that the scale argument you've just said, where things can be very distant in time and space and suddenly move very rapidly, as Tim will, talks a lot about tipping points, but also our ability to respond so quickly. I hadn't actually thought about that, and you've picked that out. I think that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well done, Laurie. Tick.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the feedback was much more crude when we were doing that.
Okay, Tim wants to join in at this point.
Great to see you, Laurie. Thanks for a lovely talk. I'm kind of sat here reflecting on my own efforts at the moment that you and I have chatted a bit about. I'm busy working on a narrative, developing the narrative of positive tipping points, and trying to sort of operationalize that in some form. And the part of the subliminal agenda, as you know, is not about just policymakers or rich people or somebody else having the agency to create positive change, but we all have that agency. At the same time, I 100% behind what you're saying. And I suppose my question orbits around the fact that in my advocacy for the fact that we need to start a process of transformative change, that kind of means we need to embrace destabilizing, as you kind of agree, certain well-established institutions. In fact, we need to embrace self-reinforcing feedbacks that we can't control. We kind of have to leave a modernist mindset behind. But that is, as you well know, extremely scary to most people, especially our leaders, most of whom are the champions of said mindset. So I'm just wondering if, I don't know if it's a contradiction, but I think, you know, I certainly am advocating for, we have to embrace uncertainty. We have to deliberately destabilize certain dominant modes of operation. But of course, that could be perceived in the waterfall diagram or something as just adding to the problem. Because Tim, you're just taking the carpet of a few stable institutions, even if they are flawed, out from under us by trying to fundamentally change things. I don't know if I don't know if I'm coming across clearly enough, Laurie, but I wonder, how do you reflect back on that? Because I think you and I are kind of on the same page with this, but it wouldn't be a nonsensical reaction to sort of, for somebody else to come in and say, hold on a minute, you're this transformative change agenda, you're deliberately destabilizing these, albeit flawed, but at least semi-functional institutions that can rescue people when the shit hits the fan, to put it bluntly.
There have been major paradigmatic shifts in the political economic consensus in this country and others around the world at various points in the past, and ones that maybe aren't even of the scale that we need, but have happened before in this country, happened after the Second World War and happened after the crises of the 70s, right? And in every single case there was huge contestation and antagonism within governing institutions. And that wasn't just policy, that wasn't just in politics, right, of parties beating other parties. There were massive battles in the treasury, in other parts of government, in civil society organizations, you know, the list goes on and on and on. And at the moment, we're seeing some of that progress coming to bear. I would urge anyone who's interested in this to keep an eye on, say, the commentary coming out of the US press around economic policymaking in the US, particularly the attitude towards deficit spending. There's huge contestation there. But what Biden is saying around we can spend this amount and it should be of the order of trillions wasn't just politically unthinkable when it comes to the calculus of, say, Congress and the Senate voting back during Obama's time. It was unthinkable intellectually for a lot of those policymakers. I mean, they thought that there was some of them literally an existential threat to America because of debt, and in particular Chinese ownership of debt. And we knew that that wasn't accurate at the time, and it definitely isn't accurate at the moment. And there's been a massively antagonistic and contested process that's led us to that position of change now. And so there must always be this process of challenging the existing strategies of institutions. That must always happen. And in many respects, I feel quite hopeful that my generation could be, in 20 years' time, leaders of governments that do have things that are pretty close to a Green New Deal as conceptualized over the last couple of years. My concern is that our strategies for further shunting things up that exponential curve of change won't be robust to the fact that the context in which we're going at exponential curve will be changing. You know, there's two moments of exponential change that you look at will be meeting each other. And there'll be huge opportunities there, but there'll also be massive threats as well. And that's my fear, is that antagonistic process of institutional change, for me, it needs to, we need more of it, but it won't be robust to the nature of politics at 1.72, for example, you know.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I guess we're both kind of agreeing in that UK-US comparison that there's some sort of, as you said, the deficit of this up and coming new kind of leadership over here. Maybe it's a cultural thing as well. Maybe we're just such a small c conservative nature. I don't know. But as you say, in the past, even in this little island, we've managed it before. So yeah, I'm with you.
It needs people to draw it out. Even the Treasury, there are people there gagging for change, but they just need the types of people.
I was about to just quickly follow up on that. I feel like you that I know some of them personally. There are good people in the civil service who are waiting in the wings to be the leaders. So perhaps we agree the deficit is actually in the elected MPs at the moment. But yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tim.
That was really interesting. We have a question from Sam, but I can't help but jump in again. So what Tim said really resonated me in the sense that when I have discussions about the dysfunctional nature of, you can call it politics or the climate policy system, there is a reticence to do some of the destabilization because we're worried about pulling the whole thing down on top of us. We're worried about actually destabilizing might precipitate some of the unpicking, might unravel some of those social institutions that we need. And I think my position is that we can't compromise on speaking the truth of the matter, what we think is true, right? And we shouldn't caveat and maybe censor ourselves. I think in the past we have been perhaps, not that we haven't told the truth, but maybe we haven't said some things because we've been very mindful of recognizing of the potential destabilizing impacts that might have, and us having tremendous ignorance about how these systems are meant to work, right? So the last thing we want to do is make it worse. But I'm completely convinced by your argument that given where we are in the trajectories of change, it's a disservice to not do it now because we really are running out of time, right? I just had to say that. I'm not asking you to reflect on it because I know Sam wants to ask a question, but that was wonderful. Sam, please.
Yes, thank you. And I guess thank you for having me because I'm slightly interloping on your GSI seminar, given that I'm not part of you. But yeah, thank you for talking. Brilliant. I kind of wanted to build on maybe that final point about almost the deficits in our politicians, but also reflect on the fact that kind of we are where we are. And a lot of my work is kind of looking at these climate change targets, particularly up to 2030, under the understanding that we've got kind of at least another couple of years of our current form of government. And if the polls are anything to go by, potentially the entirety of this decade could be governed by the Tories. And given the things about credibility that you started off saying and kind of developing credible targets and timelines and plans of action, how would you what argument would you make to say that how do we engage with this kind of in its current form, short of pulling it all down, which I am in favor of, but just kind of might take a little bit more time?
I think that in the antagonistic process that we're talking about, we have to recognize that there are huge opportunities right now in being able to shift the kind of dominant political economic paradigm, right? If you look at just the last year, the types of things that people are saying in academia, in think tanks, in politics, in civil service conversations around certain economic policies were unthinkable in many respects in the past, or they would be talked about and, people would say, oh yeah, that was really nice. I read that book as well. And I think that we've yet to really grasp that opportunity that's opened up. I don't know if you feel the same as this, but sometimes when I'm doing my work, we're so used to almost attenuating arguments around what types of economic policy are needed, policies in relation to industrial strategy, what local governments can do, because we're used to a situation where the status quo that we've seen in large parts, been quite similar over the last 40 years, is just immovable. And a lot of opportunities open up, and I don't think people are necessarily jumping into it as fully as could happen at the moment. And in the context of the sort of chaos of the pandemic, the way that it's absolutely, or sorry, let me put it like this. It's often said that pandemics just accelerate what was already happening. And a lot of what's happened over the last few years around, for example, the May administration beginning to talk about industrial strategy and adopt those frames, or beginning to move away from an explicit austerity frame, just to take two things that are related to macroeconomic policy. The pandemic has just accelerated, or at least opened up an opportunity to accelerate some of those trends. And while the government has ditched industrial strategy as a frame in itself, I think there is more openness to beginning to ratchet up some of those narratives and that policy change. Now, I don't think that means over the course of the next decade we'll have a government that's doing what is necessarily needed in those areas. But again, if you think of an ecosystem of influence that's growing and maturing and shunting up change up an exponential curve, ratcheting up the Tory government, the current government, to adopt certain ideas alongside targets sort of sets the momentum for the next stage. And it should never be forgotten that many of the things that we associate with Thatcherism happened under James Callaghan, the Labour Prime Minister before Thatcher came in. And there were changes occurring in, say, the Treasury and other areas that were building further momentum, that then got taken further by a new government and then locked into what became a governing consensus as time went on. And one last thing I'd add is that in relation to the point that James was making earlier about the role of academics in then being antagonistic and contesting current institutions and policies, firstly, I don't think an academic by themselves is going to tear down any of those things. People have much more leeway to throw the weight around than I think maybe we sometimes think. And of course, it's a personal decision. But secondly, there isn't the, if you can call it, behind the scenes infrastructure that exists across this ecosystem of influence to have some of the difficult discussions. So for example, when I saw James's article with Bob Watson and Wolfgang Knorr, and then I saw the people's reactions on Twitter and all this kind of stuff, there was a really interesting discussion there, which partly wasn't able to happen properly among those people because it was being done in public. So people were saying, oh, you know, should we be saying this in public? And what probably should have been happening is everyone should have been doing it maybe off Twitter together, and maybe they are, and saying, right, we've got two issues here. We've got the strategic picture of how we relate to governments and institutions as academics in general, but particularly in the context of the difficulty in net zero, the ridiculousness of negative emissions, And what's our strategy for that, guys? Because we all kind of agree with some of the diagnosis here. The second thing should have been then, well, how is that discussed publicly? What's the public frame that we then use to start to be antagonistic, in particular around targets and the inadequacies of policies? And that behind the scenes conversation, which can be mediated by formal or informal infrastructure, as it were, it doesn't have to be mediating organizations, it can just be personal relationships, I think is something that often is missing. It may not be the case here, but, you know, Twitter replies it can't happen like that because it's a, you know, public discussions around sensitive issues themselves attenuate what is then being discussed. And I think that's a really important part to your question, Sam, of what's the infrastructure behind the scenes that can enable people to converse across the ecosystem to say, you know, oh, there's a particular opportunity there to be antagonistic to this part of government that can further build that momentum and take us up the exponential curve. So what should we do to strategize around that, you know? Sorry, that was a long answer. I know we're over time.
That was a great answer. And we are over time. But I will offer the floor just to any very, very quick questions or observations, because there was quite a few here.
I've got one more that I wanted to take with Laurie. I know from many years ago, one of your statements, at least, and I want to know if it's changed, is about bringing more scientific literacy into governance. And that seems to be, drilling through, that seems to be one of the key messages that you think could really help. So is that still true? And how do you think we do that? How do we motivate essentially scientists, I suppose, to get involved in politics?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was a constant frustration of mine when I was doing physics, actually, and not to point at anyone who's in the physics department at Exeter or any other department, but was that there, you know, I was partly inspired to do physics because I'd read about all these amazing physicists who themselves were pretty political at the end of the day, you know, not just your Einsteins, but others, more niche figures that aren't really remembered now, like Solly Zuckerman and others who were sort of big talkers during the Cold War. And I think that it's very important that we do have more people with a science background who go into politics. I'm, of course, not the first person to say that or to point out, for example, that Margaret Thatcher was hot on climate before it was cool, and that was often attributed to the fact that she was a chemist. But I think that awareness, particularly in an age of exponential environmental change, is even more important, so that you can scrutinize what is happening and, crucially, better explain it to the general population. We often forget that politicians hold a really interesting role in society, which is they're often or can be explainers. And any really effective politician has often been an explainer. Again, if you think about Thatcher, she was just constantly trying to explain what was happening in her particular take to various audiences. And if you look at previous political leaders, they've often been successful when they can explain. And I can tell you that a lot of my peers who haven't got a science background, I'm not saying I'm very good at it, but they can't even conceive of what's happening, let alone be prepared to explain it to general populations when we're at 1.62 or something, you know. we also know that scientists play an incredibly important role in the bureaucracy, and that, for example, DEFRA scientists have been crucial to beginning to ratchet up change within Tory politicians that we're seeing at the moment. So that's another really important part of it. And advisors, as well as public intellectuals, maybe are different now in a different media environment, but they're still important, as the pandemic has showed us. And encouraging more people who study physics or other allied sciences to go into those kind of positions instead of, spending their entire time in industry, excellent idea. Spending their entire time in academia, excellent idea, is a particularly important thing. And I think that one of the key things to do there is to have people who break the mold, who become sort of demonstrable first movers for some of those people and set a precedent, and then to just get them to come back and tell inspiring stories, and to change in some ways the curriculum. I was absolutely dying out for it, and we would talk about this, me and Nathan, when we were in lab, I think. And sometimes this is awful, I would sit there and read politics textbooks. I mean, what a geek, that's awful, But to have that part of the curriculum that tells you about the history of science and some of the philosophy around science, around the massively politically contested elements that went behind the developing nuclear weapons, and then how many scientists felt about that at the time, the huge politics that goes behind scientists who've worked in climate change, that kind of stuff, chuck that in the curriculum, teach people about it, get them fired up about those kind of things. It's essential for us to do that. And I think, sorry, I know I'm babbling on, but it would help with this current difficulty that a lot of colleagues are feeling about how to balance their work academically within their role as communicators, as people who may be involved in politics privately. I think it would help develop a bit more of an internal conversation by introducing that into curriculum, so that those kind of things can be openly discussed from the get-go as you go on an academic science path.
Fantastic stuff. We could talk about this all afternoon, but we can't, because we've got to go back to marking our assessments, or maybe some of us have got to submit our assessments. But just let me thank you once again, Laurie, for a fascinating talk, a wonderful discussion. Thanks, everyone. We have recorded this, and we'll be sending out the link later, so share with your friends and colleagues who couldn't make it today. But other than that, many thanks for all, and thanks, Laurie.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and please be in touch, and I hope to meet many of you soon.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Good luck with the assessment.